that many people, initially assume it would be dubious that someone could project or accurately project the moment of inevitable failure of the present obfuscation of the currency. And in fact, the Ron Paul camp, that is, the supporters of Ron Paul, regularly assert, in the spirit of Austrian economics, so-called, that math can't be applied to economics because math can't account for indeterminate human behavior. But this isn't true at all, and any mathematician knows much better. Because, in truth, if there's something that math can't account for, we know what that is, and we know, too, to what degree we haven't accounted for it. In other words, the only way that you come up with a solution to a mathematic problem, what is the sum of 2 plus 2? What is the sum of 2 plus 3? What is the sum of 2 plus 4? 2 plus 5? Each of these problems, if you will, has a finite solution. That is, there is only one correct answer. And in truth, that is the case with any such mathematic problem. There are ways of resolving issues mathematically when the issue is not understood, and those methods are generally called numeric methods, and ballistics is an example of them, where Isaac Newton had postulated that the deceleration of a projectile would be proportional to the square of its velocity. And in the late 1800s, there was many different studies done, largely by military people, where downrange velocities were attempted to be ascertained. And the first striking thing that was discovered was that the pattern of deceleration in no way complied with Newton's postulate that deceleration would be proportional to the square of velocity. Now, of course, there was no qualification of this theory, and it wasn't a formal theorem of Newton's. It was just more or less an uneducated guess, because particularly at the supersonic speeds of projectiles which are involved in ballistics, there was no basis for determining what the pattern of deceleration was. Newton realized that it would be relatively great, but why it would be proportional to the square of velocity regardless of the shape of the projectile and so forth, or sectional density of the projectile and so forth, would have, of course, just the questions of those two further matters would have given Newton, reason to pause and think, well, no, it couldn't be simply proportional to the square of velocity. It would have to be proportional to further things. Nonetheless, numeric methods are a method of determining, interpolating and extrapolating values within or without known ranges regarding issues that we don't understand conclusively in such a way that we could actually calculate them by a formal process which accounts for all formal matters. And ballistics is one of these endeavors where the actual time of flight and from the time of flight the trajectory of a projectile are determined by, in fact, 7 different functions of the form of a times v to the n, or where a variable a of a velocity specific range is multiplied times the velocity raised to the power of n, which is also a velocity specific variable. So This Russian scientist Maevsky determined this pattern for 7 velocity ranges. So there were 7 functions, Gavra functions they're called, which modern ballistics is calculated with extreme accurately, but not by an actual knowledgeable process which accounts for all of the factors explicitly. That is, given this shape, we would have this aerodynamic efficiency, which in turn results in this time of flight and trajectory and so on and so forth. Well, in the case of calculating the maximum possible lifespan of any purported economy subject to interest, or subject, in other words, to this purposed obfuscation of our promissory obligations to each other, which obfuscation is meant to exploit us. It's easy to calculate the maximum possible lifespan of the system, and in fact, contrary to what the so-called Austrian economists are constantly replying, the process is very straightforward, and the math is no more difficult than the very same concrete, definite math of the banking system, by which the banking system calculates your next month's interest on your remaining debt. So all these models that I provided the Reagan administration actually do is, given any interest rate, any sum of circulation, and any principal, they simply reborrow the principal paid out of circulation and the interest paid out of circulation as a new debt equal to the old, plus the periodic interest on it. So in fact, given any rate of interest, an initial principal and circulation, it's very simple and straightforward matter to calculate the maximum possible lifespan of any purported economy subject to interest, or this obfuscation of our currency, which results in terminal exploitation by multiplication of artificial indebtedness in proportion to capacity to pay or service debt. So this process is very straightforward, and this is why I've always provided my computer models complete with source code, which in 30 plus years, no one has ever invalidated the logic of this simple process. And it's amazing, in effect, because the only difficult thing about making the projections or executing the models would be to forecast the rates of interest that would be applied in the future. And of course, when the Reagan administration asked me, whether or not it would be possible to project when the economy would fail according to this thesis of mine, and I answered affirmatively. They asked me how, and I explained how these models would have to work, and that they would simply borrow back the principal as new principal equal to the old, so you don't even have to perform that function. But they would also borrow back the interest as new debt above the former sum of debt. The only issue would be determining the rates of interest that are to be applied across this time. And of course, during the Reagan administration, Paul Volcker was imposing double-digit, or the Federal Reserve System, which Paul Volcker, was the chairman of, was imposing double-digit prime rates at the time, ostensibly to fight price inflation, which I disproved. In fact, which process I disproved could service at all, because all it does is transfer the cost of price inflation to unearned profit of the banking system, making it impossible for us to afford the increasing prices of industry, therefore compromising the margins of solubility of industry, which is forced to service this ever-escalating sum of debt itself, you see. So it's preposterous. I mean, that we don't even think that oh my gosh, they're claiming to benefit us by eliminating the increasing prices which are caused by interest, by increasing the rates of interest so much that we can't afford to pay for the increasing prices which would sustain our industry. And of course, so we forced our industry over all this time off to other places, which I call expatriation of industry as a result of this multiplication of artificial indebtedness. So anyway, I asked the Reagan administration, and in return, all you have to do is tell me, given these conditions, this is what we're going to charge in the way of interest, or the Federal Reserve is going to charge. They shrug their shoulders, to speak figuratively, and they had no idea. I was telling them they needed to lower interest rates, and they had been insisting that they maintain elevated interest rates. And I explained that no, those were the cause of price inflation, and you're not really solving it. You might prevent it from happening, but you're inflicting a greater cost and a greater escalation of the indebtedness, which shortens the lifespan. I said, if you keep up these rates of interest, it's possible for this economy to collapse in just a few years. If you serve another term, this was in the halfway through the first term of the Reagan administration, and I said, if you serve another term, there's a very good chance this economy will collapse in the second term. And of course, we saw the signs of it doing that, and they decreased interest rates in respect to that failure, as I had proven they would have to decrease interest rates. So they said, well, they didn't know what to do. And I said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. And that is, I will create a logic whereas we reach the limits under a certain rate of interest to service the debt that we have, and those would engender terminal failure at that point in time. I'll just implement some logic where we'll decrease the interest rates just enough. And of course, this very pattern that I advocated is exactly what's transpired in time, not because it's a remarkable thing to project that, but in fact it's a very unremarkable, mundane thing to project that, because as the sum of debt escalates at an ever-escalating rate, an inherently ever-escalating rate, in the end the multiplication of indebtedness is phenomenal. And the only thing that allows us even to tread water is a perpetual reduction of interest rates. So what I advocated doing in my models was deploying some logic which would reduce the interest rates just enough whenever we reach the brink of terminal failure under a given rate of interest, to reduce it enough to extend the lifespan a bit further, and then allow this algorithm, which would act much as they naturally act in response to the events around us, in decreasing interest rates reflexively rather than intelligently reducing them to zero, rejecting this whole proposition of terminal exploitation and restoring our promissory obligations to what they are, and that is strictly obligations to pay and retire principal from circulation. That's the only solution. You see, and they wanted to mess around with seeing how far into the future it might last, so that they could go on with their preposterous ideas, which were some of the most blatant failures, which were ever proposed. So anyway, I advocated deploying this logic of reducing the interest rates to replicate the natural reflexive pattern to which they responded to what they call recessions, but which in fact are the dips, above what we can service in the way of debt under given interest rates, and to modify that downward to what we can service given the escalation of debt by reducing interest rates. So this pattern of reducing interest rates is the only thing that was remarkable about deploying these models, which can accurately calculate for any given rate of interest,